it's nothing to do with you. Trust me.
Don't take it personally, one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, you tell? Why are they waiting? Oh, because, well, that's interesting. Okay, I'm gonna ping Brian and probably start the intro. All right. Welcome, everybody. Brian, are we good? Yes. Okay. We are live streaming this, so I just wanted to make sure that that is on and happening. So welcome, everybody, to the 14th Annual Deborah Pulliam Memorial Lecture. My name is Lisa Simpson-Lutz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Castine Historical Society. As many of you know, if you're from Castine, Deborah Pulliam, who passed away in 2007, was a major benefactor for not only the Castine Historical Society, but the Witherley Memorial Library, Castine's Unitarian Universalist Congregation, and the Maine Community Foundation. We're forever grateful for her generosity that has literally transformed the Castine Historical Society into what it is today. So tonight's lecture is not only an in-person event, but we are live streaming it on our YouTube channel. Yes, we have a YouTube channel. It's amazing. So those of you who are watching tonight from afar, welcome. This event is also being recorded. So if you know people who couldn't attend tonight, in about a week, it is uploaded onto our website, castinehistoricalsociety.org. And you can watch it and any of the other programs that we've had in this year's series. So this is the 6th in a series of programs called Hidden Legacies, Uncovering Castine's African American History. This series is partially funded by a grant from the Maine Humanities Council, and it focuses on the untold stories of Maine and Castine's African Americans and African Americans from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. So if you are interested in tonight's program and haven't seen our earlier ones, please go to our website and watch them. We've had speakers from all throughout Maine and Castine speaking, and it's been really, really enlightening. The series is a result of several years of ongoing research by the CHS staff and a commitment by the organization to uncover, tell, and preserve the unknown, forgotten, and even hidden stories of Black individuals and families who lived and worked in our community. There are 2 more programs in the series, and the next one is also an in-person but also live stream talk by Dr. Mary Freeman of the University of Maine, and she's going to be talking about abolition and the Underground Railroad in Maine, which is her specialty, and she's done a great deal of research on this. And we're going to end the series on October 14th with something a little different, a walking tour of Castine's African American history, led by myself and Georgia Zildjian. And there is a rain date. So hope you can attend. Needless to say, that will not be live streamed. We couldn't quite figure that one out. So again, I encourage you to look at our website, castinehistoricalsociety.org. Or if you want, please, on your way out, pick up one of our brochures on the table. All of our events are in the brochure here. And also, there's newsletters on the front table. If you're not currently a member and don't receive them, please pick up a newsletter. And there's also a membership form. If you're not currently a member of the Historical Society, we encourage you to join. Members receive our scholarly newsletter, special pricing for events, and a 10% discount in our gift shop. Plus, as a member, you're helping fund exhibitions and education programs like what you are seeing tonight. So I would be remiss to not tell you about one more upcoming program. There is something about it on the table out front. We are doing a series of stakeholder meetings, and the last one is Monday, August 28th at 6:30. It's in person. It's in the Mitchell Room of the Historical Society. What we are doing is we're reaching out to people in the community and asking you, what would you like to see if we renovate the 2nd floor of the Abbott School, make it handicapped accessible, or accessible, because it barely is now, and put in a permanent exhibit on the history of Castine. We've been asked about this over and over by people who come to visit us. They love our exhibits like the Clark Fitzgerald exhibit, but that's one slice of Castine's history. A lot of visitors from away especially come here and they want to see the whole scope of our history, and we are not able to accommodate that right now. So we are going to be renovating the 2nd floor, putting in an elevator, and we want to hear from you. What stories do you want us to tell in this permanent exhibit? So this is your chance to give us the feedback that we need for this long-range project. This is it is a very big undertaking, and it will be quite a number of years before it comes to fruition. But we want to start by hearing from you, residents of Castine or people who are interested in Castine's history. All right, so I got off script there. Oh, and also, we're serving wine. So that's the other incentive that we realized, well, if we serve wine, they might come. So there's an incentive right there. So tonight, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kate McMahon. She is the historian of global slavery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution. So Kate is one of the catalysts for the research we've undertaken at the Castine Historical Society. In 2020, was it 2020 that I heard the NPR talk? I heard Kate and her colleague Meadow Dibble of the Atlantic Black Box Project. And if you're not familiar with this, please Google it, check out their website. It's amazing, Atlantic Black Box. And they were talking about slavery in Maine. And this was information I'd never heard before, and information you may not have heard before. And it really made me pause and think, were there enslaved men, women, and children in Castine? I didn't know. And so it really was a catalyst for us doing 3 years of research, and this will be ongoing. This will not stop because it's hard research to do, it's hidden, it's very hard to find, but we have over this time uncovered a great deal of information about the small but robust group of individuals who lived here from the late 18th century all the way up to the early 20th century, Africans and African Americans. And we've uncovered amazing stories that we have been bringing out in this series of talks, in our newsletter, in the walking tour. So thank you to Kate for being one of the catalysts for this. Dr. McMahon has received her BA in Art History and MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. She completed her PhD in History at Howard University in 2017. And she is a Mainer, by the way. Okay, born and bred. Her dissertation was entitled The Transnational Dimensions of African and African Americans in Northern New England, 1776 to 1865. Her current research at the Smithsonian explores New England's connections to and complicity in the illegal slave trade and colonialism from 1809 to 1900. And she's committed to exploring the living legacies of slavery and the slave trade in the present day and interpreting this history for a broad public through frequent public speaking engagements and scholarly production. So please welcome Dr. Kate McMahon.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, good. Let me just get my notes out here. Thank you so much, Lisa, and to the Castine Historical Society for the invitation to come here tonight. This is my first time in Castine. It definitely won't be my last. I have just absolutely loved being here and learning about this wonderful community's history. And you know, I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight. And I have some information probably that will be new, some information that may not be new for you all. So my talk is titled Cargoes of Despair, Northern New England and the Slave Trade. And I first encountered this research primarily during my dissertation research at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I came about it by going to the National Archives, the Library of Congress, for my dissertation advisor researching his book. And I came across a document about a Mainer who had been charged in the illegal slave trade in 1845 in the law library. And it set off the series of events that have led me here. And you know, I'm just very privileged to be able to talk to you all tonight and to talk about this history. Turn it on. This button. On. There we go. Okay. So I'll frame first what the global slave trade was and what it did. Slavery and the slave trade touched nearly every continent on Earth. The way that we live, the food that we eat, the cultures and the language that we live with, all are shaped by the history of the slave trade and colonialism. The trade was driven by waterways. It was driven by rivers and oceans and the technological advancements that happened that allowed us to traverse waterways. And in particular, the slave trade really began around 1450 because the Portuguese and other European nations suddenly developed the ability to build vessels and the navigational tools that allowed them to get to the west coast of Africa and to traverse all of the currents off of the west coast of Africa. And they also, of course, it was being pushed by the discovery, quote unquote, of the Americas by European nations, and the push for labor in particular really became something that increased exponentially over the 15th and the 16th centuries as Europeans colonized the Americas and looked for cheap labor sources, especially after indigenous people were killed off or were no longer allowed to be enslaved by various colonial nations. Obviously, this had huge demographic consequences, cultural consequences, political consequences, social consequences that we still see today in Africa. 12.5 million people, at least, were embarked from Africa. 10.7 million people survived the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage to arrive in the Americas and to be enslaved. But millions more were born in the Americas and were enslaved here throughout the period of slavery from the 15th century until the last nation, Brazil, abolished the slave trade in 1888. So this had massive consequences, and forms of unjust labor, forced labor continued well past 1888 into the 20th century, and we still see those legacies today. And so, this had this massive human toll of around 15% of people who did the Middle Passage, went aboard a slave ship, perished during the Middle Passage. But at times, this mortality rate was significantly higher, as high as 30%, and I'll talk about some of those cases today. That was particularly true for the period that I'm talking about. A brief background about slavery in the District of Maine and the state of Massachusetts. Maine, of course, did have enslaved people here. There were hundreds of people enslaved, especially in the southern part of Maine. York County had the most significant population of enslaved people in it, as well as the greater Portland area, Falmouth, and Gorham also had populations of enslaved people. And so we see, for example, this is a document here, William Pepperell's will, which at the top, it's hard to read, of course, on the slide, but his will contains the ownership of several enslaved people, including at the very first line, an expense for Black George. Pepperell was one of the largest enslavers in the state of Maine. He owned dozens of enslaved people at any one point, as did members of his family. He regularly traded enslaved people between his plantations in the Caribbean and southern Maine and Portsmouth. And so this is a letter that is in, I believe, the Maine Historical Society from Benjamin Bullard to William Pepperell. June 25th, 1719, he says, "Sir, I received yours by Captain Morris with bills of lading for 5 Negroes and 1 hogshead of rum. 1 Negro woman marked Y on the left breast died in about 3 weeks after her arrival in spite of medical aid which I procured. All the rest died at sea. I am sorry for your loss. It may have resulted in deficient clothing so early in the spring." So these people aboard this vessel froze to death because they were not properly clothed on this vessel. And Bullard is not talking about the emotional, spiritual loss due to these deaths. He's talking about the financial loss to William Pepperell. And so this is just a glimpse into how Mainers, some of our founding fathers, these people whose names are on our geographies, on our streets, on our buildings, exploited enslaved people for generations and continued to profit off their labor well after the period of slavery ended. And Maine and the legal slave trade was complicated. So Maine was, we have limited records prior to about 1800 for Maine in the slave trade. And in general, shipping records prior to 1800, anyone who does this kind of research knows that it can be very difficult to find consistent record keeping, and things get destroyed, you know. What we do know is that there was a colonial market for enslaved people in the town of York by 1650, so quite early. But we only have a small amount of evidence for Maine's role in the slave trade prior to 1800. We know that there were enslaved people here. We know the names of enslaved people, primarily because of probate records and other things related to estates. But we don't know how most of those people got here. We don't know if they were purchased in the Caribbean, if they were purchased in Africa, if they were brought here from wherever they were brought from, if they were born in the United States even, or what would become the United States. What we do have evidence for is a small set of vessels here that you can see, primarily in the 1770s, for a few different towns. Sheepscot River, of course, is the closest one to here, but we also have several records for vessels in the greater Biddeford area, Berwick, southern Maine. The vessel that we have the best record for is this one, the Betsy, which was commanded by a man named Samuel Lanphier from 1752. And he went to Guinea and purchased an unknown number of enslaved people to sell in the state of Maine. So prior to the American Revolution, Massachusetts citizens had made 2 attempts to stop the trade in enslaved Africans. But they were not favored by the colonial governor of Maine, District of Maine and the state of Massachusetts, and therefore they didn't go anywhere. Rhode Island and Connecticut did pass resolutions barring the importation of enslaved Africans into their borders, but none of the colonial powers made any attempts at limiting the engagement of their citizens in the traffic in enslaved Africans elsewhere, especially to the Caribbean, which is an example of what we saw on the previous slide. It was not until 1787 that Rhode Island passed the first law in New England barring this, of course, which went largely unenforced. But it did levy a 1,000-pound fine for fitting out a vessel and 100 pounds per captive. Massachusetts and Connecticut followed with similar legislation in 1788. However, as scholar Elizabeth Donnan noted in the 1930s, quote, "The legislative situation was confused by questions of jurisdiction and constitutionality, all of which tended to aid the slave trader and to increase the zeal of abolitionists for federal rather than state action." So there were a lot of legal gray areas during this time period, the 1780s and the 1790s. So Maine had its own laws about this, but or Massachusetts had its own laws about this, but they were different than the federal laws, and so it got to a lot of these issues of jurisdiction, and charges tended not to stick, or they were inconsistently enforced. One vessel where we do have really good records is around this ship Eagle, which was a vessel from Portland. And this vessel was owned by Thomas Robeson, who was a rum merchant from Portland, who essentially hired a man named Thomas Hodges to purchase enslaved people in Africa with the intention of selling them in Haiti. Henry Hodges and the vessel's captain, Henry Skinner, decided to stop and sell these enslaved people outside of Haiti because the French had basically said, you can't sell enslaved people here. And Americans, to bypass this, Hodges and Skinner sold 29 people aboard a French vessel named La Jérôme, sorry, my French is not good, and sold them there at a profit. This document here records the prices that they received for each enslaved person that they sold, the 29 enslaved people. They made a tidy profit. So they returned to Maine, and this whole thing was discovered, and they were brought up in court in Massachusetts, and subsequently they were fined 200 pounds for fitting out the ship and 50 pounds for each enslaved person, which obviously is a pretty significant fine at the time. having violated that 1788 Act in Massachusetts. Elizabeth Donnan argued that merchants like Robeson nearly immediately began trading enslaved people after the American Revolution had put a halt to that inhumane traffic. She said, quote, "Remembering the profits of earlier days, merchants whose fortunes had been shattered by war might well look to slave traffic to restore their vanished estates. Captains and seamen, so habituated to the commerce in blacks that it offered no offense to conscience, were still available." So while we don't have significant records for the numbers of people that were traded during this time period, especially the 18th century, we do know that there were significant numbers of people trading enslaved people from the state of Maine and Massachusetts. And we have problems assessing the slave trade in the state of Maine. We have a few different reasons for this. One is, in general, there's been a lack of research and a lack of interest. Recently, this has really started to change, like folks like Lisa taking up the cause and really pushing for a better understanding of local communities' complicity in slavery and in the slave trade. There's also a misunderstanding of what the slave trade was. We tend, generally, popular culture has led us to believe that there are slave ships and there are other ships. And that's really not the case. Slave ships were often also merchant ships. One journey they might do a merchant trip, the next journey they might sell enslaved people. There are very few vessels that were specifically built for the slave trade, especially after the mid-18th century. After that period, we see far more vessels that were used as slavers that were also merchant vessels, that were doing other merchant activities, often at the same time that they were trading enslaved people, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So we tend to overlook a lot of vessels when we're doing research. We're like, oh, that's not a slave ship, that was a cotton ship, or a sugar packet or something like that, when in actuality, at one point it was a slave ship. We have a lot of inaccessible archives in the state of Maine, things that have not been digitized, that are sitting in small historical societies who don't have a budget or the means to digitally reproduce things, and so folks don't know those records are there and they're not accessible to historians and researchers. And then, of course, we also have a lack of support for this type of research in our New England institutions of higher education. There's nowhere in Maine that you can get a PhD in history and study something like this. Unfortunately, that's why I left the state of Maine and went to DC for my PhD, was there was nowhere here that I could do this type of research. So, there have been a number of, hopefully, universities are making a lot of changes, and that is something that will also change in the next few years. So the illegal slave trade is the period for the United States that we talk about after 1808. The legal participation of American merchants and seamen and ships ended in 1808. It was followed the British, who did it in 1807. Some vessels did sail and land in the United States illegally. However, it pales in comparison to the number of American ships that were transporting enslaved Africans between Africa and other points in the Americas, especially Cuba and Brazil, which I'll talk about a lot tonight. And there are a few reasons why we don't see that many vessels that landed in the mainland United States proper. American ports were patrolled by navies. We had customs and tariffs and all of these different things that made it much more difficult for slavers to bring enslaved people here. Enslaved people also, if they did not speak English when they were brought up to auction, there were certain local laws in most places that maintained slavery that would have made it illegal to sell these people. So it made it very difficult for enslavers to try to sell people in the United States proper. However, Americans participated in the illegal slave trade to these other places in increasing numbers throughout the 19th century after 1808. And it increases at an exponential rate, and we see this also with the rise in the number of people being transported, especially to the sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean and South America, especially Brazil and especially Cuba. And this is all being driven by the global, huge desire for sugar. Sugar is really what's, in the 19th century, what is driving the illegal slave trade. It is pushing the slave trade to increase because in the sugar-producing colonies, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person was 7 years. So they were expected to live for 7 years, and therefore they did not have a self-reproducing population of enslaved people like we had here in the United States. In the United States, our population grew by natural birth. We had more people born than died. In the Caribbean and in South America, that was not the case. So that was really what was driving it. And of course, when that is happening, when things are illegal, the price, the profit is something that also increases significantly. So with great risk comes great reward for these merchants and for these seamen. But we do have a significant number of Mainers that I've been able to find that were engaged in the legal domestic slave trade. So the slave trade between ports in the United States. And I found these are two examples from Freeport, two slave manifests for vessels that were owned by a Freeport merchant named Rufus Soule, who is considered to be one of the founding fathers of Freeport. He built 100 vessels by his 65th birthday, and how was he such a genius to be able to afford to do this? And when you start to dig and pick a little bit, you see that he was transporting enslaved people along with his cotton and his sugar, including 25-year-old Caroline and her 6-year-old and 1-year-old sons. So, you know, this is a destroyer of families, a destroyer of lives that Mainers were engaging in as though it was an everyday normal thing, and it really was to them. And of course, as an aside, Rufus Soule was also engaged in the illegal slave trade, which I have a talk at Freeport online if you want to learn more about that. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about this vessel called the Gray Eagle. The Gray Eagle was built in Robbinston, Maine, which is up near Lubec. So a tiny town, very small population, along with several other slave ships during this time period. So they were building slave ships, or ships that ended up in the slave trade in the 1850s. It was registered in Philadelphia in 1854, and it was consigned that year by one of the most notorious slave merchants, John Machado, who was a Portuguese citizen originally, who became naturalized in the United States. And Machado was one of the most notorious slave traders in New York. His office was on Wall Street. He worked with primarily American vessels to hire them to participate in this slave trade. And so why was he looking for American vessels specifically? Well, American vessels had the right against search and seizure without probable cause. So the British couldn't just board their ship unless they had probable cause. And so this gave the American flag the top protection of any of the vessels at sea. They could, if there was not probable cause, if they couldn't see enslaved people on the deck, if they couldn't see other things like the stove to make food for the enslaved people, especially farina when we're talking about Brazil, which is a pasty rice sort of porridge product, they could not be boarded. And so therefore, American vessels became the preferred vessels during the 1840s and 1850s in particular. And in the 1840s, they were going to Brazil because that's where the center of the sugar boom was. And in 1850, the Brazilian government finally began to push for the stopping of the slave trade from Africa into Brazil, although they still had a robust internal slave trade until their abolition in 1888. And that's recentered sugar production and the slave trade to Cuba in the 1850s. So the Gray Eagle was consigned by Machado, who then hired a man named James Darnaud to go to Dahomey in present-day Benin to purchase 600 enslaved Africans at the Ouida slave fortress, which is on the coast of Benin. And here you can see this is actually the king at the time, the king of Dahomey, and this was the capital of Dahomey at the time. And so the Gray Eagle is hired, and this is testimony from one of the crewmen as to what happened. A Spaniard came on board in the month of April, who I afterwards understood was one of the owners. The Gray Eagle was called an American vessel when I shipped on board of her at New York. She hoisted the American flag going to the coast. I saw no flag coming back, but I understood from the Portuguese on board that if any flag was to be hoisted, it would be the Spanish flag. We were chased, but found it to be a merchantman. An English man of war chased us for a while after we had shipped the Negroes. We ran. The longboat had taken the small Negroes in. It was on the main hatch. They were taken out of the boat during the chase so that they might not be seen, and the Negro women were taken from the quarter deck. We had all sails set during the chase. We took the studding sails to tack and put her on wind. We were 10 or 20 days at Cuba, but were not more than a couple of hours landing the Negroes in Cuba. We lost some 18 Negroes by death on the passage and threw them overboard. Some few were born on board. And so this really shows you the depravity and the horrific conditions that these people suffered through for the sake of the ship owners and the merchants. And this image, this beautiful painting, is actually in the Penobscot Marine Museum. And this is an unknown slave ship that you can pull it up on their website. There are enslaved people lining the back of the vessel. And so you can see them, they're on one side, but you can also see the sailors, and this is a likely British ship. So one fascinating thing about the Gray Eagle is that we know quite a lot about one of the enslaved people who heavily resisted his enslavement on board, as well as his wife, who pushed for his abolition, his release, and actually was successful. So Dasalu was born in a town called Abeokuta in Nigeria. He was, as a younger man, a slave trader, so he participated in the internal African slave trade within Nigeria. And at some point, he converted to Christianity. Upon his conversion to Christianity, he stopped slave trading. He believed it to be against his religion and became a regular, legitimate trader of goods. He and his wife changed their names. He changed his name to John the Baptist, Dasalu, and his wife changed her name to Martha. Abeokuta was attacked by the kingdom of Dahomey in the early 1850s. He was captured during this fight and held for ransom because of his high status within the community. The ransom was not paid, and he was enslaved and trafficked to Cuba aboard the Gray Eagle. So he is one of these almost 600 people that were landed in Bahia Honda, which is west of Havana. And in the slave trade in general, they tended to not land in larger cities. They landed on beaches, especially in Cuba. They abandoned the vessels. So this is a brand new ship. They abandoned it after this one vessel. That's how profitable this journey was, that these vessels, brand new, beautiful vessels, were disposable to them. They could just burn it. It was inconsequential to them. Martha, upon learning that Dasalu had been captured but not killed, sought assistance. She traveled to Bagheri to speak with a pastor named Charles Gulmer. Upon her behest, he searched for people with contact with the Dahomey leaders. Communication was established between Dasalu and Martha. She received a message from him through the network of liberated slaves. He sent 4 cowries, 4 cowrie shells, the little shells that you see in warmer climates, meaning 4 eyes or face to face for reunification. It had a symbolic meaning that she understood. Through this network, it was conveyed to her that Dasalu had been freed and transferred to another holding location. It wasn't communicated that payment was needed to secure his freedom so this is during the time period in which he's being held within Dahomey. This miscommunication around his status and location caused this delay in paying his ransom. So he sent her another message through this next network that he was desperate, and Martha conveyed this message to Gulmer, who dispatched men to Ouida to get him. Dasalu was known under a different name in Dahomey, and the search party was unable to get him, which is how he was sold aboard the Gray Eagle. In Cuba, he was able to send a letter to Gulmer about his condition and asked his family and the help of the British consulate to secure his freedom. And they were able to lobby support and to use contacts to secure his freedom, and he was able to return to Nigeria, which is such a fascinating story. We have an image of him. We have these letters that have survived from Martha and have been transcribed in the 19th century. And so it's one of many instances of enslaved people doing everything they can, of using their networks of freedom, of liberated people, of enslaved people to try to push and advocate for themselves and for their freedom. And so really what we understand is that through a case like this is that this is a building block of the New England economy. This is not something that is just a small component. This is something where millions and millions of dollars are flowing back to Maine. So, for example, I have calculated that at least 20,000 enslaved people were transported by Maine ships between 1850 and 1860 alone, only to Cuba. I have not completed my calculations for Brazil, but I suspect it's around the same amount, if not more. The average number of people aboard these vessels was 647. The average sale price of a captive in Cuba at this time period was $400, which is about $12,000 today. And so the average, I'll skip through some of this, you can read it. The estimated value of the New England slave fleet by the New York Times in 1857 was $11 million in 1857, which is about $332 million today. Coming back every year, $332 million is coming back into the New England economy. To put that into perspective, the value of Maine's timber industry, this is a state record document over here, was estimated to be $2.5 million in 1852. So the value of our slave ship fleet is nearly 4 times as high as our timber industry. And of course, some of that timber is going into the slave fleet. So, you know, this is a huge, there's many tendrils connecting to all of these other industries, shipping, coopers and caulkers, and you know, all of these different people who unknowingly, in most of these cases, of course, benefited from this slave trading. And so we see here, this is a plan of the slave ship Marie Seraphique, which is one of the best known plans of slave ships. This was a vessel that was specifically built for the slave trade. And if you can believe it, this is about half as many people as were stuffed on board a vessel of the same size aboard the Gray Eagle. This vessel was about the same size as the Gray Eagle, and there were 2 times as many people on board that vessel. And we can learn a lot from the newspaper articles at the time tell us this was not a secret. This information has been buried after the Civil War. So this has been something that has been revised out of our historical memory after the Civil War. These vessels say, this top article says, it is estimated that the slave fleet, which leaves New York, Boston, New Bedford, Portland, and other eastern seaports in a single year, numbers some 40 vessels of different sizes, varying from 100 to 400 tons, capable of carrying 300 to 600 slaves. And this other article talks about the avarice of American and New Englanders. The avarice has grown more subtle in its evasions and watches and seizes its prey with an appetite quickened rather than suppressed by its guilty vigils. American citizens are steeped up to their very mouths, I scarcely use too bold a figure, in this stream of iniquity. They throng to the coasts of Africa under the stained flags of Spain and Portugal, sometimes selling abroad their cargoes of despair, and sometimes bringing them into some of our southern ports, and there, under the forms of law, defeating the purpose of the law itself and legalizing their inhuman but profitable adventures. And funnily enough, today I was sitting in the Castine Historical Society and rediscovered in my own archive of, I've been doing this research for 10 years and I have way too much stuff that I've hoarded onto this computer. A vessel that was built in Castine. The brig Yankee was built here in 1833. After traveling to Brazil, it was consigned by a slave trader in Bahia and headed for Mozambique on the east coast of Africa, where the captain, John Goodrich, purchased 600 enslaved people to sell in Brazil. Edward Porter, who was the British consul at Bahia at the time, wrote to the Earl of Aberdeen on May 30th, 1843, noting that the Yankee, quote, after being sold, proceeded to the coast under American colors with a cargo belonging to individuals engaged in the slave trade, which having been exchanged for slaves, they were received on board. And it is said that she has succeeded in landing them at the port of Santos. The master, John Goodrich of the Yankee, has returned here in a Sardinian brig and reports having disposed of this vessel on the coast. However, it is well known that the sale was concluded before the vessel left this port, meaning Bahia. So TBD on that. I've got to revisit it and dig more on about the Yankee. But we scarcely see a corner of this whole coast that wasn't touched by the slave trade in some way. And so if you'd like to learn more, this is the database that I'm developing. You can use this QR code or go to this website here and scroll through some of the vessels. So you'll see this whole list that has been transcribed, and I have put as much information as I have about the vessels on that website, or in a truncated form. So it's a quick and easy thing to scroll through. And this is the brig Kentucky, which is in the Penobscot Marine Museum. And it is also a slaver. I talk about this in a couple of other talks that are online. If you're interested, Google me and Google it. And thank you so much to the Castine Historical Society, and especially Lisa, and to everybody here tonight. Thank you so much for being such a great audience, and I'm happy to take questions.
So because we have our online audience, when there's a question, I'm going to come to you and give you the mic. So do we have questions? Comments? Here we go. Okay.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I'm curious what countries were actively trying to combat the slave trade in the early 19th century?
Sure. Primarily in the early 19th century, it was the British. So the British really in 1807, not only were they pushing for the abolition of the slave trade by their citizens, they were also advocating with other countries through diplomatic means to abolish the slave trade. The United States did have some vessels that were commissioned to look for Americans that were engaged in the slave trade, but the United States didn't actually build its first vessel to look for Americans involved in the slave trade until 1842 because of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, oddly enough, which it's a somewhat obscure treaty, but it also, the same treaty, resolved the northern border of Maine, oddly enough. It was the result of the Aristocratic War, and that's why this treaty came about. It resolved that, and the United States, we agreed that the St. Johns River was the border, and in the same treaty, we also agreed that we would finally pay for commissioned vessels that were specific for the slave trade. So the USS Saratoga was built at Portsmouth that year. And then we really began a much more concerted effort of trying to stop Americans involved in the slave trade. So there were Africa squadrons off of the coasts of East and West Africa, especially West Africa. And there was also different squadrons that were in the Caribbean and Brazil. And, various countries did sort of try to stop the slave trade. Brazil technically legally ended the slave trade in the 1830s to their country, but didn't actually end it, didn't actually enforce the end until 1850. So it was largely scattershot, and it was often very politically based, so whoever was in the seat of government, as we see with many things today, whoever is in the seat of government, it really has a lot of sway as to whether or not citizens are being prosecuted for the illegal slave trade. The only person ever hung, after 1820, it became piracy and therefore a capital offense to participate in the slave trade. The only person ever hung was Nathaniel Gordon from Portland. So he's the only person, and that was 1862. Lincoln was president. The Civil War was happening. It was very much a political move, but there were really very little consequences. None of these people had any consequences that I talked about tonight. They were known, they were identified. This is all in parliamentary papers, newspapers, congressional documents. So at most, people got a fine, for the most part. So you see a real lax enforcement of these laws. Fines, very short prison sentences are pretty much the most any of these guys suffered from. And really, after, it was only in the late 1850s that people started to really suffer more serious consequences. But during the same time period, there were multiple Maine citizens in jail in New York City waiting trial and for engaging in the slave trade in the late 1850s and early 1860s. So.
I wanted to know if you have any information about research that has been done on the African countries and how they were affected by this whole slave trade.
There's a lot of work being done right now to understand the living legacies of the slave trade. And in Africa in particular, it's quite complicated because the post-slavery period is as bad for Africans and African ethnicities and now countries as the period of slavery. Colonialism, when Africa in particular was carved up during the Berlin Conference of the late 19th century into these different colonial nations, so French West Africa, Belgian Central Africa, all of these different areas, that was as exploitive, deadly, and horrific for the people that lived there as the period of slavery was. And it is something that colonization especially is really present in most of Africa, I would say today. You see that really all of the countries that we know of as Africa are artificial boundaries that were drawn by Europeans and not primarily by Africans. And so we see these inter-ethnic warfares, all of that stuff is all a legacy of these slavery first, and then colonialism coming in after it, and pushing people to where they would never have interacted together, pushing for war. And a lot of these, like Dahomey had these relationships with different colonial powers, specifically to supply captives for European nations. So that persists going backwards. So there's a lot of work being done on that topic, especially by African researchers who are dealing with those contemporary crises.
Okay, we have an online question from Teresa. Is there any documented research having to do with the African countries participating in the slave trade?
Lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of research. Dahomey, in particular, it was one of the major sites of embarkation from Africa. So millions of people went through a place like Dahomey and other different slave fortresses on the west coast of Africa. And so there is significant research that's been done on this work. You can pick up any book by Patrick Manning. He's written a lot about it. So there's a lot out there. I would Google the subject. You can find it all pretty easily online. There's a lot of scholars.
Staying with Africa, we spent a little time in Tanzania and understand that as a central port for the Eastern slave
Yes.
trade. Do you know any information about any main?
I do. I actually work in Mozambique as part of my work with the Smithsonian, and then also I've done a lot of research on East African slave trading. And yes, the Indian Ocean is similar and different in many ways. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean lasted much longer. It has a much longer period, and it is not as well known and as well studied as the West Coast. So there are some really fantastic scholars that have done work on that. Abdul Sharif is a Tanzanian. He's from Dar es Salaam, and his work on Zanzibar in particular is really foundational to a lot of the contemporary work that's being done today. And actually, I'm on the operational committee of a website called slavevoyages.org, which is the largest database chronicling the transatlantic slave trade. And we just got a grant to add in the Indian Ocean. So we are currently, my colleagues are currently working on adding in the Indian Ocean, and we should hopefully understand a lot more in the next couple of years about the Indian Ocean slave trade. But it lasted, there were parts of the Indian Ocean that had legal slavery until the 1930s. So it is something that people are maybe only a generation or two disconnected from. I saw recently, someone sent me for a boy in Tanzania, German East Africa, his freedom papers from 1890 something. So, this is something it's very close to the present day that people really live with significantly.
I want to know how they got the slaves in Africa to get on the ships. Were they kidnapped?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so how most people ended up in the slave trade was through war. So there were a lot of different reasons this was happening. A lot of them are colonial pressures. So there's these people, these colonial powers that are pushing people together, that are pushing one group to attack another group for the slave trade, to clear land, to do all of these different things. So primarily, they were captured as the result of war. We have narratives of enslaved people. Actually, a boy that I gave another talk recently for well, there's one from Pejepscot Historical Society. I talk about a boy named Pedro who ended up coming to Maine and living in Maine, in Paris, Maine, who was captured. And he talks about, he was about 12 years old when this happened, and talks about how his tribe was attacked by a neighboring tribe. And his brothers were brought, but he thinks the rest of his family was killed. And so that narrative survives. So we can read the accounts of enslaved people who were captured to better understand the process. But yeah, we have to remember that the majority of enslaved people aboard these vessels were technically children in a lot of cases. So these people were under the age of 18. The preferred age for an enslaved person was between the ages of 12 and like 25. So, but you know, what we see, especially in this later period, is they're mostly children. They're mostly 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And then that is for a reason. You know, they are easier to force to do things. They're not going to fight back. They're not as strong in the eyes of their captors.
Could you say something about how much activity there was in Maine, either before or after the fugitive slave laws, like Atticus returning to another state, someone who had escaped, or even perhaps like Solomon Northrop, people who had been freed and were returned for profit, or any of those?
Are you asking about people being re-enslaved by Mainers?
Yes.
I don't know of
Or
any.
returned to the owners.
Oh yeah,
in
or
another
being
state,
returned.
who were
fugitive
demanding their return.
People being returned. I don't know anything about that specifically. I do know that there is a fabulous collection waiting for someone to do a dissertation on it at the Maine State Archives on a man named Atticus, who was a fugitive who was captured, I want to say it was like the 1830s, and there's all of this legal back and forth between Maine and I want to say it was Georgia where he was from. I could be wrong about the details, but at any rate, there were definitely, those things did happen. Atticus is the best document that I've found. There's multiple documents because it ended up at the legislative level that we have that have survived. How widespread that sort of thing was, where slave catchers were coming into Maine, I don't know. There's another document I just remembered now of a man named John Trott in Kennebunk, who recaptured an enslaved man whose name escapes me right now, but it's also at the Maine State Archives around the American Revolution, like 1778 or something like that. So, you know, the American Revolution is going on, and this person self-emancipates to Horse Island or something like that off of Kennebunk, and they send slave catchers after him, and he is recaptured. So you think you might have something better to do during the American Revolution, but people, you know, these enslavers wanted to retain their captives, and at any cost. So it's certainly something that happened here. We have a few tantalizing glimpses, like these two records in the Maine State Archives. If you haven't been to the Maine State Archives website recently, I highly suggest it. The new Maine State Archivist, Kate McBrien, is amazing. She's a friend, and she has done such a fantastic job continuing the work of digitizing collections related to African American history. And so those are all up online. You can download high-res versions, transcriptions, all of that stuff, and read through them.
Given the difficulties of finding enough seamen, as reflected by the British impressments of American sailors that resulted in the War of 1812, was there, what is the story of blacks, slaves, as sailors on these ships?
There was a great book called Blackjacks by Jeffrey Bolster, And he talks about black seamen. It's a whole book about black seamen, and Maine is part of that story, Maine and Massachusetts. I haven't seen, in the state of Maine, I don't think I've found any evidence of enslaved seamen. But around that time period, Maine abolished slavery when it was still part of Massachusetts in 1783, 1784. So, well, I don't see a lot of those sorts of records. I have seen an absolute plethora of records of black seamen from the state of Maine. So you look at any community on the ocean that had a black population, and certainly someone is working in the merchant marine, is working at, and I'm sure Lisa can talk more about that, about Castine specifically. But in any of the larger communities, Portland especially, a huge portion of the black male population worked in different aspects, everything from working in the shipyards to actual seamen.
Yeah, Castine's African-American males were almost always sailors, and one was John Jackson, and there is an article about he and his daughter out in the lobby in our newsletter. John was a young boy who was captured in Africa, and he was sent to Rio de Janeiro. So perfect example of that. And he ends up in New York City. He self-emancipates. He hides himself on a ship and gets to New York City and becomes a sailor there. But it becomes too difficult for him to stay because he knows there's a lot of slave catchers in New York. He ends up here in Castine, and he marries an African-American woman here. This is in the 1830s, and they have a large family, some of whom become sailors, some of the boys. And he's an example of all those things. A young boy who is captured, sent to he works the sugar plantations, but survives, unusually, and makes it to New York and then to Castine, where he continues to be a sailor with the Whitney family. And so he's basically the example of these stories. And he comes here, we think, because it's relatively safe for him in this community. So good example of that.
Great example.
Thank you for your talk. I am curious if you have economic numbers. I saw the slide with the $2 million of timber industry to the $11 million in the slave trade. Do you have some numbers on the adjacent economy? So, barrels and dried fish and everything going to the West Indies?
I tried to find those kinds of figures that were calculated in a meaningful way. Couldn't find them. This was the closest thing I could find that was of the same relative size of an industry. They didn't do those sort of statewide assessments in the 19th century where they were like, oh yeah, our industry of fish salting is where is valued at this X amount of dollars. So it's a very difficult thing to calculate. The relative values are very challenging things to calculate. I'm not an economist or a mathematician either, so I've gone to this easiest figure that I could actually find a big number for of value.
I'm curious to know how much of this information, if any, is being brought into the schools.
Not much yet. I mean, I haven't written my book yet because I have a toddler and a full-time job. But there is a concerted effort in some communities. There was the recent legislation pushed through by the Speaker of the House, Rachel Talbot Ross, that is mandating that African American history is taught in schools. There's obviously, to get that to come down to the individual district level is really challenging. And so right now there are districts that are doing this work. So Yarmouth, I know, is doing this work. Portland is doing this work. Those are the two that I've been involved with, so those are the ones I know the best. But I know other places in the state are doing that work. You know, I have a colleague in Rumford, Adelaide Solomon Jordan, who's been doing this work with elementary school kids for like 15, 20 years or something until she retired. So I think there's definitely efforts in some of the bigger places, but you know, it's really scattershot. And of course, the further away from the coast you get, the less likely you are to get this information, especially in places that are not, don't have a significant African American population or African population.
So some good news, our education committee is embarking on this for the Adams School. It's, again, a long-range project. It's not going to be next year, but we think within 2 years we're going to look for a grant from the Maine Humanities Council to help us hire someone to do this, because we want to make sure we do this correct. So let's hope that Castine will be a leader. Yeah. Hopefully you can help. All right. Well, I think, you know, Kate will stay. And if you have individual questions, please come up and ask her. But we are getting on in time. And thank you, everybody, so much for coming. I hope you come back for our September lecture. That will be at Emerson Hall. And again, it will also be live streamed. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kate. Appreciate it.